My wife told a table full of her friends that she married me for my looks, not my brains, while I stood there holding chips. When I told her I was done being her punchline, she smirked and said, "Oh please, you love my friends. You just like pretending you don't." I just stared at her. That was 9 months ago. Yesterday, she deleted everything after the comments turned on her. My wife kept humiliating me in front of her friends for years, but her last attempt to publicly shame me backfired. I have been married to my wife, Laura, for 5 years. When we were dating, I thought she was witty, charming, and confident. But over time, I realized her humor wasn't clever. It was cruel, and I was her favorite punchline. About a year into our marriage, she invited her friends over for dinner. I cooked because I enjoy it, and one of her friends complimented the food. Instead of letting me have that moment, Laura smirked and said, "Yeah, he's great in the kitchen, probably because it's the only place he's useful." Her friends laughed. I laughed too, even though my face burned. Later, I told her it hurt. She rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, you're so sensitive." They knew I was joking. It became routine. Her jokes escalated over time. If I mentioned work, "Don't get him started unless you want to fall asleep." If I was tired, "Maybe if you actually exercised instead of just thinking about it." If I shared an achievement, "Wow, now he can finally afford something other than instant noodles." At a BBQ, her friend asked if I could fix things around the house. Laura jumped in. "Fix things? He's great at breaking them. That's sort of the same thing, right?" Everyone laughed. I swallowed my pride and smiled like it was fine. Whenever I tried to talk to her about it, she'd turn it around. "You're overreacting. Stop being dramatic. If you can't take a joke, that's your problem." Once I told her she embarrassed me on purpose. She shot back, "So now I'm an abusive wife just because I have a personality?" A few months ago, at a birthday dinner, someone asked if we were planning to have kids. Before I could speak, Laura laughed and said, "With his genes? I'd have to think twice about that." Her friends roared with laughter. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. Last month, she had friends over again. I brought out snacks while she told an exaggerated story about me panicking the first time I changed a tire. She ended with, "Good thing I married him for his looks, not his brains." Everyone laughed again. I stood there holding a bowl of chips, feeling humiliated in my own home. That night, I told her, "If you keep treating me like this, I'm done going places with you." Her smirk was instant. "Oh please, you love my friends. You just like pretending you don't." 2 weeks later, she wanted me to go to another dinner with her friends. I refused. She huffed, "So you're just going to make me look bad?" I said, "No, I'm just done being your punchline." A few days later, I ran into one of her friends at the grocery store. She awkwardly said, "I hope you don't take Laura's jokes too seriously. Sometimes she goes too far." That was all I needed. I realized I'd spent years pretending her cruelty was just her way, when even her friends could see the truth. That night, I told her, "I want a divorce." She laughed like it was a joke. Then her smile fell. "You're seriously ending this over a few harmless comments?" "No," I said. "I'm ending it because you've made it clear you have no respect for me." She tried guilt-tripping me. "So you're throwing away our marriage because you can't handle my personality?" I told her, "Your personality isn't the problem. Your cruelty is." She packed a bag and went to stay with a friend. I filed for divorce the next day. A week later, she went on Facebook and posted a long rant about fragile men who can't take a strong woman's sense of humor. She painted herself as this poor wife abandoned by an insecure husband. Except the comments didn't go how she planned. At first, a few of her friends commented things like, "You're better off without him." But then others, including some of the people who had been at those dinners, started chiming in. One wrote, "Laura, we love you, but honestly, you were kind of harsh with him sometimes." Another, "I thought you two were fine, but now that I think about it, you did put him down a lot in front of us." Then it snowballed. People started recalling specific things she'd said. Others flat out told her she was out of line. She deleted the post within hours. Now it's been a month since I left. She still sends the occasional angry text, but I don't respond. But yesterday, I went to check my bank account to pay rent, and the balance was zero. Every cent from our joint savings was gone. An hour later, I got a text from Laura. "Consider it compensation for wasting my time." My hands shook as I stared at the phone screen, then back at my laptop showing the empty account. $47,000 gone. I called the bank immediately, but they confirmed what I already knew. Joint account holders can withdraw funds without the other's permission. Next call was to James, my divorce attorney, who told me to screenshot everything and come to his office first thing in the morning. I couldn't sleep that night, just kept checking the account like the money might magically reappear. James filed an emergency motion the next day for financial misconduct and asset dissipation. 2 days later, Becca called me out of nowhere, said she needed to talk about Laura and it was important. We met at a coffee shop downtown where she slid her phone across the table, showing me a text thread from 6 weeks ago where Laura had written about getting her ducks in a row and how I wouldn't know what hit me. Another message said she deserved every penny for putting up with my weakness. Becca's hands trembled as she scrolled through more messages where Laura bragged about planning to clean out the accounts before I could react. She agreed to provide these texts to James as evidence, said she couldn't watch Laura destroy someone like this anymore. A week later, the emergency hearing arrived and I wore my only suit, trying to keep my hands steady as James carried a binder of evidence 2 inches thick into the courtroom. Laura walked in wearing designer clothes I'd never seen before, probably bought with our savings, her new lawyer Kenneth trailing behind her. Judge Wells reviewed the evidence carefully, her expression growing sharper with each page she turned. She looked directly at Laura and asked her to explain why she withdrew $47,000 from joint savings 1 month after divorce proceedings began. Laura's rehearsed answer about protecting herself from financial abuse fell apart when James presented 5 years of tax returns, showing we'd contributed equally to that account. The judge's voice turned cold as she ordered Laura to return $30,000 to a court-controlled account within 72 hours, with the remaining $17,000 to be addressed in final divorce proceedings. Laura's face went through disbelief, then rage, then this cold calculation as she she hissed to her lawyer that this was ridiculous. Outside the courthouse, Kenneth tried damage control, suggesting mediation to James, who shut him down immediately. Said Laura had poisoned that well when she stole my financial security, and we'd see them at trial. Laura stormed past us to a new BMW I didn't recognize, probably leased with our money. 3 days later, the court-controlled account showed a $30,000 deposit, and I could finally breathe again, though the money stayed frozen pending the divorce trial. David came over to help me create a strict budget while we waited, told me she'd shown her true colors and no judge would forget this. I started therapy with Dr. Jennifer Park now that I could afford it again, and she validated what I'd been feeling, said financial abuse is abuse, and my reactions were normal responses to abnormal treatment. We started unpacking 4 years of systematic humiliation, all the times Laura had torn me down in public and private. Then Laura emailed me directly, violating the lawyer-only communication rule we'd established, writing that I'd turned everyone against her, and this wasn't over. James filed this violation with the court immediately, adding it to our growing documentation of her hostile behavior. 2 weeks later, Becca called me in tears because Laura had found out about the texts and was telling everyone Becca had betrayed her, that she was jealous of Laura's success. Laura had even called Becca's HR department trying to get her fired, the cruelty extending beyond just me now. James subpoenaed Laura's financial records and discovered she'd opened a separate account 3 months before filing for divorce, moving her bonuses there while still taking half my paycheck for our joint expenses. He noted this showed premeditation, that she'd been planning her exit while still humiliating me publicly at every opportunity. Sandra called me that evening with news that made my jaw drop. She'd been quietly taking screenshots of Laura's Instagram and Facebook posts for weeks without telling me. She sent me folder after folder of evidence showing Laura at fancy restaurants, posting pictures of designer shopping bags, and checking into expensive hotels. The timestamps were damning because half of these posts happened after she'd claimed poverty in her court filings. Sandra pointed out how Laura wasn't even trying to hide her spending, posting pictures of her new Gucci purse while simultaneously telling the court she couldn't afford groceries. James was thrilled when I forwarded everything to him the next morning. 3 days later, I was at the grocery store picking up some milk when someone tapped my shoulder. I turned around to see a tall guy with dark hair looking uncomfortable. He introduced himself as Tom Harrison and said he was dating Laura. My stomach twisted as he explained that some things weren't adding up about what Laura had told him. We ended up sitting in his car in the parking lot while he spilled everything. Laura had told him I was physically abusive and that she'd escaped with nothing but the clothes on her back. He'd started questioning things when she showed up to dates in a new BMW wearing designer clothes. I wonder why Laura thought she could drain their entire savings account and just text him about it like that's normal. Something tells me this isn't the first time she's done something calculated like this. The way she called it compensation seems too practiced. When he asked about the expensive stuff, she claimed they were gifts from supportive friends who were helping her rebuild. The real shock came when he mentioned they'd been dating for 4 months. I pulled out my phone and showed him the divorce filing date from 2 months ago. His face went white as he checked his phone and confirmed they'd started talking on dating apps in January, 3 full months before I'd even filed for divorce. He looked like he might throw up right there in the parking lot. I gave him James's number and suggested he might want to share what he knew. Tom agreed immediately and said he had screenshots of everything, including Laura's dating profile from January. The profile was brutal because she'd described herself as single and ready to mingle after escaping an abusive marriage. He showed me the screenshots on his phone, and I could see our living room in the background of her profile pictures. My books were visible on the shelf behind her, and even our wedding photo was partially in frame. James met with Tom the next day and came away with a goldmine of evidence. A month passed before depositions finally started, and Laura showed up looking confident until James started presenting evidence. She stuck to her victim story right up until James pulled out the dating profile screenshots. Her lawyer immediately requested a recess, and I could hear them arguing in the hallway through the closed door. The court reporter kept having to mark down that the witness declined to answer when they came back. I met with Jennifer, my therapist, later that week to process everything. She helped me see how Laura's public humiliation had been her way of justifying the cheating to herself. Every cruel joke had been projection, making me look bad so she could feel better about betraying me. The pattern was so clear now that I couldn't believe I'd missed it for so long. David invited me over for dinner with him and his wife the following weekend. Watching them together was like seeing what a healthy relationship actually looked like for the first time. They teased each other, but you could feel the love behind every word. His wife kept assuring me I'd find someone who treated me right once I healed from Laura's poison. Their kids were running around laughing, and the whole house felt warm in a way mine never had. Laura's deposition resumed 2 weeks later, and she tried to minimize everything as just joking around. James let her talk for a while before pulling out his laptop and hitting play on an audio file. Becca had been recording video at one of the dinner parties for someone's birthday and caught everything. Laura's voice filled the room, dripping with contempt as she told her friends I was basically useless, except as a paycheck. The video showed me in the background serving drinks to everyone while they laughed. You could see my face clearly, and the hurt was obvious, even though I was trying to smile. Laura's friends looked uncomfortable in the video, and several of them glanced away when she really got going. The court reporter typed every word while Laura's lawyer kept objecting unsuccessfully. James played 3 more clips from different occasions that Becca had recorded, each one showing the same pattern of cruelty. James sat back in his chair and let the silence fill the room while Laura's face went from red to white to red again, and Kenneth shuffled through his papers like he was looking for something that could help, but we all knew there wasn't anything. The court reporter's fingers stayed ready over her keyboard, and James pulled out more papers from his briefcase briefcase and slid them across the table toward Kenneth, who read them, and his shoulders dropped even more. These were the amended divorce papers James had prepared, and they added adultery and emotional abuse to the grounds for divorce, which Colorado might be a no-fault state, but marital misconduct still affects how property gets divided. James tapped the papers and said Laura handed us everything we need, and this won't go to trial because they'll settle. Kenneth whispered something to Laura, who shook her head hard, but Kenneth kept talking and pointing at the papers and the videos we'd just watched. 2 weeks passed before I finally got around to cleaning out the garage because I couldn't stand looking at all our stuff anymore. Box after box of photos from vacations and holidays and dinners with friends, all showing this woman smiling next to me, who seemed like a complete stranger now. Or maybe I was just finally seeing who she really was all along. I kept the legal documents and tax records, but everything else went to Goodwill, including our wedding album, which the volunteer at the donation center asked if I was sure about, and I just nodded and walked away. Kenneth called James 3 days later requesting a settlement conference, and Laura's first offer was 40% of assets if I would stop pursuing the emotional abuse angle, which made James actually laugh out loud on the phone. He told Kenneth we'd counter with 70% for us plus the house, and Laura was lucky we weren't pursuing damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress, which was a real thing, apparently. My phone buzzed that night with a text from Becca saying Laura had been banned from their friend group after more people came forward about witnessing the abuse over the years. She wrote that they should have spoken up sooner, and they enabled her by laughing, and she was sorry, which I appreciated, but it didn't change anything now. The settlement conference was scheduled for the following Monday at the courthouse, and I got there early to go over everything with James one more time. Laura walked in wearing designer sunglasses, even though we were inside, and you could see she'd been crying recently from the puffiness around her eyes that the makeup couldn't quite hide. Kenneth presented their new offer, which was a 50-50 split, where she'd keep her BMW and I'd keep the house, but James just pushed the recording from the deposition toward them and said 70-30, or we go to trial with all the adultery and abuse evidence. The mediator was this older woman who looked like she'd seen everything, and she reviewed both positions carefully before looking directly at Laura. She said, "Ms. Johnson, the evidence of financial misconduct and emotional abuse is substantial, and Mr. Mitchell's offer is generous, considering Colorado law permits unequal distribution for economic misconduct." Laura's hands were clenching and unclenching on the table, and you could see her jaw working like she was grinding her teeth. During the break, I went to get water from the fountain down the hall, and heard Laura arguing with Kenneth near the bathroom, saying this was insane, and I was stealing from her. Kenneth's voice was sharp when he told her she stole first, and she documented her affair, and she was recorded abusing me, so she needed to take the deal. 3 days went by with no word, and then James called to say Laura accepted the settlement where I'd receive 70% of assets, plus the house and my retirement accounts would stay untouched, while she'd keep her car and $50,000. The paperwork would take weeks to finalize, but the war was basically over, and I felt empty instead of victorious, like I thought I would. Jennifer, my therapist, validated that emptiness at our next session, saying I loved who I thought Laura was, and grieving that person while the real person still exists creates complicated grief. We worked on separating the fantasy from reality, and acknowledging that both were real to me at different times, which helped a little, but not much. Tom reached out through Facebook Messenger, which surprised me since I didn't even know he knew who I was, but he said he broke up with Laura after learning the truth from the deposition. He shared that she tried the same humiliation tactics with him and called him weak when he questioned her stories about me, and he only lasted 2 weeks after hearing everything while I survived 4 years, so I was stronger than I knew. David showed up at my door the next day with a six-pack and dragged me to this packed sports bar downtown where people were watching the Broncos game and living their normal lives. The noise felt good after months of lawyers and depositions, and I actually laughed when someone spilled beer on David's shoes and he just shrugged it off. He watched me relax into my chair and said I looked different, like I could finally breathe again, and he was right, because I'd spent years tensing up before Laura walked into any room. 3 weeks passed before the moving trucks showed up, and Laura came to get her stuff with her sister helping her pack boxes. She didn't say anything while loading her grandmother's china and the art we'd bought in Santa Fe, until she noticed I'd already taken down every photo of us from the walls and shelves. She stopped packing and stared at the empty spaces where our wedding photos used to hang. I told her she'd been gone from those pictures long before I took them down, and she just went back to wrapping dishes in newspaper. Her hands started shaking when she taped up the last box, and suddenly she was screaming that I'd ruined everything, that all her friends thought she was terrible, that her reputation was destroyed. I stayed calm and reminded her that I'd just told the truth, and people made their own decisions about what that meant. She grabbed her purse and left without taking 3 boxes of books and old college stuff, but I figured I'd ship them to her sister's place where she was staying. That night, the house felt completely different without her things taking up space, and I cooked salmon without worrying about her complaining about the smell. Sandra came over with wine, and we sat on the back deck watching the sunset over the mountains, and she raised her glass to say something about freedom, but we just clinked glasses instead. Laura's playing victim while her dating profile screams single and ready to mingle with their wedding photo literally visible in the background. That's some next-level denial right there, folks. Nothing says, I'm totally available, like photographic evidence of your existing marriage lurking behind you. The nightmares started a few days later, where I'd be standing in front of crowds trying to speak, but no sound would come out no matter how hard I tried. My therapist, Jennifer, said it made sense because I'd been silenced for so long that my brain was still processing what that meant. She kept reminding me to use my voice even even when it felt scary. Becca called out of nowhere, inviting me to a dinner party with the old friend group, and my first instinct was to say no, because the anxiety hit immediately. But I forced myself to go and spent the whole drive practicing normal conversation in my head. People actually listened when I talked about my new project at work, and someone mentioned they'd missed having me around. The real version, not the nervous one who barely spoke. A month later, James called while I was grocery shopping to tell me Laura was trying to contest the settlement, claiming she'd signed under duress. He had all the documentation showing she'd had 3 separate mediation sessions with her own lawyer present, so the judge would probably throw it out fast. The hearing only took 20 minutes, with the judge looking through the mediation recordings and notes from both lawyers before dismissing Laura's claim completely. She told Laura the settlement was negotiated fairly over multiple sessions, and the court found 0 evidence of any duress. Meanwhile, Tom had posted something on LinkedIn about dealing with manipulative people in relationships without using Laura's name, but with enough details that everyone in Denver's marketing scene figured it out. 3 different clients pulled their contracts from Laura's firm within a week, and her boss had to reassign her accounts to other people. I found myself feeling weirdly sad watching her whole professional life fall apart through mutual connections posting about it online. Jennifer helped me understand that I was grieving the person I'd hoped Laura would become, which was totally separate from accepting who she actually was. 2 weeks passed before James called about the final divorce papers being ready. I drove to his office downtown and sat across from him while he flipped through each page, pointing at signature lines with his pen. The stack was thicker than I expected. 5 years of marriage reduced to legal language about asset division and spousal support waivers. My hand stayed steady as I signed my name over and over, watching the ink dry on each page. James mentioned that most clients either cry or pop champagne at this point, but I just felt ready for whatever came next. The house transfer paperwork came through 3 days later, making me the sole owner of our place in Denver. I started with a bedroom that Laura had insisted stay beige because it was sophisticated, and rolled deep blue paint over every wall. The hardware store guy helped me load gallons of paint into my truck along with new light fixtures and cabinet handles. Each room got transformed bit by bit, her minimalist prison becoming an actual home. Sandra came over the next weekend with her SUV packed full of stuff from Home Goods and Target. We hung colorful abstract art where Laura's blank walls had been, added throw pillows to the couch she'd kept bare, and put plants in every corner. Sandra laughed while arranging books on the shelves Laura had kept empty for aesthetic purposes, and told me I was finally allowed to have personality in my own space. The house felt different with each change, less like a museum and more like somewhere a person actually lived. 3 weeks after the divorce finalized, I was grabbing groceries at Whole Foods when I spotted Laura near the organic produce section. She had her hand on some guy's arm, laughing at something he said with that same performative laugh I remembered. The guy looked young, maybe late 20s, with eager eyes and nervous energy that made my stomach drop. He was nodding too much at everything she said, hanging on her words like I used to do. Our eyes met across the display of apples, and I saw her recognize that I understood exactly what was happening. The pattern was already repeating itself with someone new. The guy noticed me looking and walked over while Laura was examining tomatoes. He stuck out his hand and asked if I was Marcus because Laura talked about me sometimes. His handshake was weak and sweaty, his smile too eager to please. I told him to be careful, just those 2 words, and watched confusion cross his face. Laura's voice cut sharp across the produce section, calling him back, that familiar edge already in her tone. He hurried back to her like a trained dog, and I left my half-full cart right there and walked out. David had been bugging me for weeks to join his recreational softball team that played Sunday mornings at the park. I finally said yes, mostly to fill the weekends that used to be consumed by Laura's social events. The first game I made a diving catch in right field that had the whole team cheering. Genuine excitement without any hidden insults or backhanded compliments. These people didn't know my history, didn't see me as Laura's punching bag, just saw a guy who could play decent softball. After games, we'd go to this sports bar downtown where the owner knew David and always saved us a big table in back. One of my teammates, Amy, asked about my divorce while we were waiting for our food. I kept it simple and just said my ex was emotionally abusive, and I finally got out. She raised her beer and said it takes real courage to leave situations like that. The validation from someone who didn't even know the full story hit harder than I expected. Work transformed once I wasn't spending mental energy defending myself at home. My manager pulled me aside after a particularly productive sprint and said whatever I was doing differently, I should keep it up because my output had nearly doubled. I realized I'd been operating at half capacity for years, using so much energy just to survive Laura's constant warfare that I had nothing left for actual work. Projects that used to take me weeks now wrapped up in days, and I actually enjoyed problem solving again instead of just going through the motions. Becca texted me one evening saying Laura had been reaching out to their friend group, trying to get back in everyone's good graces. She was apparently telling people I'd manipulated everyone against her, and that the whole situation was blown out of proportion. Most people weren't buying it, according to Becca, but it was creating awkward dynamics at group events. Some friends were keeping their distance from Laura, while others thought everyone deserved second chances and were letting her back in. The group was basically splitting down the middle over whether to maintain the boundaries they'd set. A week later, Tom messaged me with news that made everything click into place. Laura's firm had let her go after she humiliated an intern during a client presentation, apparently tearing apart his work in front of everyone until he was nearly in tears. Multiple people had complained to HR about her behavior toward junior staff over the past months, and the intern incident was the final straw. straw. The pattern wasn't just about romantic partners, it was how she treated anyone she saw as beneath her. 3 months after the divorce was final, I sat in Jennifer's office watching her scribble notes while I talked about ordering pizza without asking anyone's permission first. She looked up and said I wasn't seeking approval to speak anymore, wasn't starting every opinion with an apology, and the healing was showing in how I carried myself. We talked about maybe dating someday, not now, but the idea didn't make me panic anymore. That weekend, I invited David, Sandra, and some other friends over for dinner, cooking lamb shanks with risotto and a chocolate souffle for dessert, dishes I'd never attempted when Laura was around because she'd mock any mistake. Everyone ate and complimented the food without any cruel edges, and David mentioned this was what normal felt like, just friends enjoying a meal without someone getting torn down. The next week at softball practice, Amy asked if I wanted to grab coffee after the game. We sat at a small cafe talking about books and hiking trails and our jobs, and when I made a joke about my terrible batting average, she laughed without any meanness behind it, just genuine amusement. Everything felt different without the constant fear of being mocked. Then my phone buzzed with an email from an address I didn't recognize, but the first line made my stomach drop. Laura had found a way around my blocks to write that she knew she'd hurt me. She was in therapy now and wanted to apologize properly if we could meet. I forwarded it to James immediately, and he called within minutes to warn me this was classic hoovering, trying to suck me back into her orbit, and I shouldn't respond under any circumstances. The email stuck in my head for days, making me second-guess everything until Jennifer helped me see it clearly during our next session. She explained that real apologies need changed behavior over time, not just words, and Laura had shown me who she was consistently for years, so I should believe the pattern, not this sudden promise. I deleted the email without answering. A few days later, Sandra called to tell me she'd seen Laura at a marketing conference downtown, alone and looking rough, and when Sandra walked past, Laura stared through her like she wasn't even there. But Sandra heard Laura asking someone else about me, trying to find out where I was working now, which made my skin crawl knowing she was still trying to track my life. Spring came, and I decided to take a solo hiking trip to Rocky Mountain National Park, something Laura always called boring and pointless. I spent 3 days on the trails, camping under stars, feeling the weight of everything lifting with each mile climbed. The mountains gave me clarity about surviving, rebuilding, choosing my own path forward. When I got back, Amy texted asking if she could join me on my next hike. Why's Laura suddenly in therapy and wanting to apologize right after losing her job for doing the exact same thing to an intern that she did to Marcus? The timing seems awfully convenient when her whole world's falling apart. We took a moderate trail up to Hanging Lake, and halfway up she told me about her ex-husband who'd controlled everything she did through constant criticism and manipulation. She said the hardest part was accepting it was abuse, since society doesn't see emotional violence the same as physical violence, and hearing someone else understand that specific pain felt like being truly seen for the first time in years. Back home, I started filling the house with things Laura had banned or mocked. I bought science fiction novels and displayed them on new bookshelves, set up an easel in the spare room to paint again, organized board game nights with friends who actually wanted to play. Each edition felt like reclaiming pieces of myself she'd stolen. Then, last Tuesday evening, I heard pounding on my front door and saw Laura through the peephole, standing there with her arms crossed. She demanded closure, said she needed it to move on, kept knocking harder when I didn't immediately open the door. I cracked it open just enough to speak through the chain and told her she got her closure when she stole our savings, when she humiliated me for years, and I didn't owe her anything else. She started yelling about my cruelty, how I was being vindictive and cold, but I closed the door and called the police to report her violating the no-contact order while she screamed at my closed door about what a coward I was. The cops showed up about 10 minutes later while she was still pounding on my door and screaming about how I'd ruined her life. I watched through the peephole as 2 officers approached her, and she immediately switched to victim mode, crying about how I wouldn't let her get her things from inside. The female officer asked if she lived here, and Laura said no. We were divorced, and the officer told her she needed to leave immediately or face arrest for trespassing and violating a restraining order. Laura tried arguing that I was keeping her property, but the officers weren't having it, and walked her to her car while she shot death glares at my house. After they left, I went down to the station to file a formal report about the incident. The officer taking my statement nodded knowingly when I described Laura's behavior and said emotional abusers often can't accept losing control, then told me to document everything in case she escalated. 5 months after the divorce was final, I was having coffee with Becca, who'd stayed friends with me despite everything with Laura. She looked uncomfortable as she told me she'd seen Laura at a restaurant with her new boyfriend, loudly mocking his menu choices in front of the whole place. Becca said everyone could see him shrinking into himself just like I used to do, and the cycle was already repeating. Around that same time, Amy and I had started actually dating after months of just being friends at the gym. We took things slow and careful, both of us carrying baggage from past relationships. When I apologized for being cautious about everything, she just squeezed my hand and said we both had healing to do and should be patient with each other. Her respect for boundaries felt completely foreign after years with Laura. Then the letter came from some law firm I'd never heard of, asking about forcing a sale of the house to get Laura her share of the equity. I called James immediately, and he actually laughed, saying Laura had no grounds since the settlement was final, and she'd agreed to me keeping the house in exchange for other assets. He called it harassment through legal channels and said he'd handle it. James sent a cease and desist letter to Laura's new attorney, and the harassment stopped immediately. immediately. No more letters or calls or anything. When I thanked him, he said bullies understand power, and Laura finally realized she couldn't win this fight through intimidation anymore. 3 weeks later, Tom called me out of the blue to tell me the new guy had already left Laura after just 3 months. He said she was spiraling hard, posting all over social media about how I'd ruined her reputation, and that's why nobody would stay with her. Tom sounded tired when he said she refused to see the pattern, just kept blaming everyone else for her problems. That conversation stuck with me for days, making me think about all the other people who'd probably gone through this with her before me, and all the ones who would come after. When I brought it up in therapy, Jennifer reminded me I couldn't save everyone from Laura's abuse, that saving myself was enough, though the guilt about future victims never completely went away. 6 months after the divorce, our softball team had an end-of-season barbecue at the park. I was flipping burgers and telling stories, making people laugh without constantly checking if I'd said something wrong. When someone complimented my cooking, Amy squeezed my hand and whispered that I was amazing. Just that, no qualifiers or hidden insults waiting to spring out. Sandra called me the next morning with news that Laura had been reaching out to our extended family, trying to maintain relationships with my aunts and cousins. But Mom had shut her down hard, telling everyone that anyone who treats family like Laura treated me wasn't welcome at family gatherings anymore. Sandra said even our cousins who'd always liked Laura were backing away from her now that they knew the full story. That night, I sat down with a journal Jennifer had suggested I keep, writing down all the recovery milestones I'd hit without really noticing them happening. The list was longer than I expected. Things like sleeping through the night without anxiety dreams, speaking up in meetings without second-guessing every word, accepting compliments without immediately deflecting them, and trusting that Amy's affection was real and not a setup for mockery. Each entry was proof that I was actually healing, actually moving forward, even when progress felt invisible day to day. That weekend, Amy came over and we decided to make pasta from scratch, something I'd never tried during my marriage because Laura would have found 10 ways to mock my attempts. The kitchen filled with flour dust as we rolled out the dough, and when I turned away for just a second to grab olive oil, smoke started rising from the pan where I'd left garlic cooking on high heat. The smell of burnt garlic filled the apartment, and I stood there frozen, waiting for the criticism, the eye roll, the comment about how I couldn't even handle basic cooking. But Amy just laughed and opened a window while scraping the blackened bits into the trash. We started over with fresh garlic, and she showed me how to keep the heat low, stirring constantly, and when the pasta turned out slightly chewy, she said it had character. That perfect was boring anyway. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a message from Becca containing a screenshot of Laura's latest Facebook post, where she'd written this long thing about thriving after escaping a toxic marriage and finding her true self. The comments section was brutal, with people who'd been at those dinners calling her out, saying things like they remembered her being the cruel one, asking if this was really the narrative she wanted to push. And one person straight up wrote that watching her humiliate me had been uncomfortable for years. More screenshots kept coming as the post evolved into people sharing specific examples of things she'd said about me. And within 2 hours, Laura had deleted everything. But the damage was done because people had already taken their own screenshots. The next morning, David called to tell me I needed to see something on Reddit. And when I logged on, there was this thread in the Denver subreddit titled "Dating a Narcissist Nearly Destroyed Me," with thousands of upvotes. The guy didn't use Laura's name, but described someone who worked at a downtown marketing firm, lived in a specific luxury building, and had a pattern of public humiliation that sounded exactly like what I'd experienced. He wrote about how she'd mock him in front of friends, twist everything to make herself the victim, drain his bank account while calling him cheap, and the details were so specific that anyone who knew Laura would recognize her immediately. The comments exploded with other people sharing similar experiences with unnamed partners, but then someone posted that they knew exactly who this was about because their coworker had dated someone matching that description. Within hours, Laura's professional reputation was imploding as the thread got shared across Denver social media groups. Her company's name got mentioned, and people started connecting dots. My phone lit up with messages from mutual acquaintances asking if I'd seen it, and Sandra called saying I should add my own story, but I closed the laptop and went for a walk instead. Jennifer had told me during our last session that living well was the best revenge, that getting pulled into drama would only keep me stuck in Laura's orbit, and watching her face consequences without my participation felt like the right choice. Over the next week, the situation snowballed, as David reported that Laura had been asked to work from home indefinitely, while her company dealt with a PR nightmare. And then Becca texted that Laura couldn't make rent on her luxury apartment after the legal fees, and living beyond her means had drained her savings. Multiple people confirmed she was couch surfing, first with one friend, then another, each stay getting shorter as people realized what living with her actually meant. Her carefully constructed image of success was crumbling, and she had no one to blame but herself, though predictably she found a way to blame me anyway when an email appeared in my inbox with the subject line, "I hope you're happy." The message was short but loaded with venom, saying I'd destroyed everything, that my vindictiveness had ruined her life, that she'd never forgive me for turning everyone against her, completely unable to see that her own actions had created this situation. Laura's getting served a reality sandwich with extra karma sauce, while our guy's making actual pasta and finding joy in burnt garlic. Sometimes the best recipes come from people who let you mess up the kitchen without keeping score. I forwarded it to James without responding, adding it to the file of documentation he was maintaining, and he replied that this was typical behavior for someone like Laura who couldn't accept responsibility for their own choices. The old friend group that had witnessed years of her cruelty finally dissolved completely as people chose sides or simply walked away from the drama entirely. And Becca sent one last message apologizing again for not standing up for me sooner, saying they'd all been cowards who enabled her behavior by laughing along. The validation helped, even though it came too late to undo the damage, but I was learning to focus on moving forward, rather than dwelling on what should have been different. A month passed, and I realized one morning that I hadn't thought about Laura in over a week, hadn't checked my phone anxiously for her messages, hadn't felt that familiar knot in my stomach when passing places we used to go together. Amy noticed the change too, mentioning over coffee that I seemed more present, that the tension in my shoulders had disappeared, that I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder anymore, waiting for the next attack. The hypervigilance that had become my default state was finally fading as my nervous system learned it was safe to relax, to trust that cruel comments weren't hiding behind every interaction. Then came one last attempt at contact through a mutual acquaintance who didn't know our history. Someone from Laura's gym who approached me at the grocery store saying Laura had asked her to pass along a message. The message was classic Laura, saying she was sorry for whatever misunderstandings had occurred between us and suggesting we could move forward as friends who'd simply grown apart. No acknowledgement of the abuse, the theft, the cruelty, just vague language that minimized everything. I politely told the messenger that I wasn't interested in any contact and to please not pass along any future messages, and she seemed to understand something deeper was going on because she just nodded and apologized for bothering me. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I stood in my living room surrounded by actual friends, people who'd shown up for me during the hardest period of my life, and the laughter filling the space was genuine, warm, free of hidden barbs or cruel edges. Amy raised her beer and said something about courage and resilience. David added something about Phoenix metaphors being cheesy but accurate, and Sandra just hugged me tight while whispering that she was proud of me for choosing myself. The house that had once echoed with Laura's mockery now held dinner parties where people actually enjoyed each other's company, where mistakes were met with help instead of humiliation, where I could burn garlic or tell a boring work story without becoming anyone's punchline. My bank account had recovered and grown beyond what it had been before. My credit score was excellent. My anxiety had faded to manageable levels that didn't require medication anymore. And therapy sessions had shifted from crisis management to building the life I actually wanted. The journey from that moment of standing in my kitchen holding chips while being mocked to standing in that same kitchen, teaching Amy my grandmother's sauce recipe, felt like crossing an ocean. Each day, a small wave that had carried me further from shore until I could no longer see the place I'd started from. Laura became a cautionary tale in my past, rather than a daily reality. Someone I'd learned from rather than someone who defined me. And while the scars remained, they no longer determined my choices or my worth. The friends who'd witnessed everything said I seemed like a completely different person, but really, I was just finally the person I'd always been underneath a constant criticism and fear. Someone who could laugh at his own mistakes without shame, who could accept compliments without deflecting, who could trust that love didn't require enduring cruelty. Recovery wasn't a straight line, and there were still moments when I'd catch myself apologizing for things that didn't need apologies, or tensing up when someone's tone shifted slightly. But those moments got rarer, and the recovery from them got faster as my new normal solidified. The divorce had cost me financially and emotionally, but it had given me back something priceless: the ability to exist in my own home, in my own life, without constantly monitoring someone else's mood or preparing for the next attack. People who met me after the divorce couldn't imagine me as the person I'd been during those years with Laura, quiet and defensive and always slightly on edge, because that version of me had been a survival mechanism rather than my true self. The Reddit thread about Laura eventually died down, but the reputation damage was permanent. And last I heard through the grapevine, she'd moved to another city to start over, where people didn't know her history, though David joked that she'd probably find the same problems there because she'd brought the common denominator with her. I didn't wish her ill anymore, didn't spend energy hating her or hoping for her downfall, because indifference was more powerful than anger, and I had better things to focus on than someone who'd already taken enough of my time and energy. The humiliation she'd tried so hard to inflict on me had ultimately become her own story, a public unraveling that happened without my participation, just the natural consequences of treating people as props in her personal comedy show. My life had become quieter but fuller, simpler but richer, and while I wouldn't thank Laura for the lessons learned through pain, I could acknowledge that surviving her had taught me to recognize and value genuine kindness. The story that started with public humiliation ended with private peace, surrounded by people who knew my worth had never been determined by someone else's cruel words, and that was the only validation that mattered. The bank finally sent confirmation that the settlement was done, all accounts properly split, and my credit score started climbing back up after months of damage. My savings account grew slowly but steadily, each deposit proof that I could rebuild what she'd torn down. Jennifer, my therapist, noticed the change in how I sat during sessions, no longer hunched forward like I was bracing for impact. She suggested we move to monthly meetings instead of weekly ones, since I'd stopped flinching at loud voices and could order food without second-guessing myself. I hosted a proper dinner party for the first time in years, inviting Sandra, David, and Amy, the woman I'd been seeing for 3 months. Amy made jokes that actually made people laugh instead of cringe, asked questions instead of making assumptions, and when she disagreed with something, she just said so without turning it into an attack. Watching her interact with my sister and best friend felt like watching normal people have normal conversations. No hidden barbs or cruel punchlines waiting to drop. A coworker mentioned seeing Laura at lunch downtown, working at some small marketing company near the suburbs, a huge step down from her previous fancy office. He said she looked tired, older somehow, like the constant performance of superiority had finally worn her down. I packed up the last box of her designer clothes she'd left behind, the expensive brands she used to lord over me, and dropped them at the charity shop without ceremony. Amy and I started planning a beach vacation, comparing hotels and flight times like equals, both of us contributing ideas without anyone getting mocked or dismissed. She asked what I wanted to do there and actually listened to my answer. No eye rolls or sighs about how boring my interests were. Tom sent me a text with a screenshot from some Denver dating app where multiple women had warned each other about Laura's behavior patterns. His message said my story had spread through mutual friends and saved at least 3 guys from her treatment. I drove past Laura's favorite Italian place on my way to the hardware store and felt absolutely nothing. No anger or sadness or even curiosity about whether she still went there. She'd become just another stranger whose opinions couldn't touch me anymore. A bad memory that lost its power to hurt. Spring came around again, and I decided to plant that vegetable garden Laura had always called a waste of time and money. I bought tomato plants, basil, peppers, and even some flowers just because I liked how they looked. Each plant went into the ground like a small act of defiance against years of being told my interests were stupid. Amy came over to help me stake the tomatoes when they got tall, both of us getting dirt under our nails and not caring. We watered them together through the summer heat, watching green tomatoes slowly turn red. No criticism about wasting water or time. When the first ones ripened, we picked them straight off the vine and ate them warm from the sun, juice running down our chins and onto our shirts. Amy laughed at the mess we'd made, a real laugh without any meanness behind it, and said I'd done something amazing. She meant more than just the garden, and we both knew it. Standing there surrounded by plants Laura would have mocked, in a house that finally felt like home again. My voice filled the space without apology, making plans and sharing stories and even singing badly to the radio without waiting for someone to tear me down. Laura existed now only in old bank statements and divorce papers filed away in a drawer I rarely opened. The person who'd made me small had become small herself, a footnote in a story about learning to take up space again. I'd survived her, rebuilt everything she'd broken, and learned to recognize real love in the gentle way Amy disagreed with me, the way Sandra checked in without judgment, the way David never made cruel jokes at my expense. Something feels off about Laura working at that small marketing company now. Makes me wonder if she's actually struggling, or if this is just what people want to believe happened to her. The tomatoes kept producing all summer, more than we could eat, so we gave bags of them to neighbors who said they were the best they'd tasted. Each one felt like proof that the things Laura called worthless had value, that my choices mattered, that I could trust my own judgment about what would grow. The garden thrived without her shadow blocking the sun, just like I had, finally free to be exactly who I was, without fear of mockery or punishment. This wasn't just surviving anymore. It was living, fully and loudly and without apology, surrounded by people who knew my worth had never depended on someone else's approval. The story that started with public humiliation ended with private joy, genuine laughter replacing cruel jokes, real support replacing constant criticism. Laura became what she'd always been underneath the performance, just another person who confused cruelty with cleverness, while I became myself again, whole and happy and finally completely free. Alright, time to wrap this one up. Appreciate you letting me tag along with my 2 cents and questionable puns. Subscribe for more content like this.